When talking about sharpening stones, you'll notice they have grit ratings. And what is grit? Well, grit is simply just the size of the abrasive particles in the stones. The lower the grit level, the more coarse a stone will be, and it will remove metal very quickly. The higher the grit level, the finer a stone will be, and it will remove metal less quickly. To encompass all grit levels, I've categorized sharpening stones into three categories: coarse, medium, and fine. Now, the grit levels that I gave for these three categories are somewhat subjective and malleable because not every abrasive cuts the same. You'll find that sharpeners and different sharpening charts all categorize these a little bit different as well, but these ratings will get you right in the ballpark for how to know which grit levels to use and when. To make it even easier for you to understand these categories, I've labeled them this way: coarse equals create, medium equals maintain, and fine equals finish. Let's talk about coarse stones. A coarse stone can be used to create a new edge on your knife in cases where you have damage like chips or rolls. And chips are literally chunks missing out of your knife edge, and rolls are when the knife edge rolls over to one side or the other. A coarse stone can also be used to fix a bad factory edge. A factory edge is the edge the company initially ground on the blade. Sometimes these aren't done that well, and they can take some serious work on a coarse stone to fix. You can also use coarse stones to reprofile a knife. And reprofiling is changing the angle that was already on your knife. For example, if you had a knife that had 20 degrees on each side, known as 40 inclusive, and you wanted to sharpen it to 15 degrees on each side, then that would end up being 30 inclusive, and grinding it from 40 inclusive to 30 inclusive is what is called reprofiling the knife. Coarse stones can be referred to as repair stones. If you maintain your knives, you're generally not going to have to use a coarse stone, but they're very nice to have for very dull and very damaged knives. Let's talk about medium stones. A medium stone is great to use for a knife that has dulled after use. The knife might still cut okay, but it needs to be resharpened. Basically, they're used to bring back or maintain your knife edge. Let's talk about fine stones. Think of the fine stones as icing on the cake. A fine stone is used to refine an already sharp knife, and it'll polish the edge as well. So it's kind of a dual-purpose stone because it refines and polishes the knife edge. In most cases, it isn't going to be necessary to use a fine stone, but there's nothing wrong if you want to use one. And if you want your knife edge to look more like a mirror, these are the stones that do that. When it comes to polishing your knives in this grit range, something like the 4000 grit isn't going to look as pronounced as something that's more in the 12,000, 15,000, 20,000, 30,000 level. So the higher you go through this whole grit level, the more polished your knife edge will be. There are times that chefs will actually need knives taken to a fine stone if they need an extremely fine edge for making intricate cuts in fish and some vegetables. These stones are also great for maintaining and sharpening straight razors. Straight razors require very fine stones to sharpen them, so they're great for those as well. Lastly, don't be fooled by this being called a finish stone. You don't have to finish on a fine stone. It's just the furthest you can take an edge for refinement. In summary, if you want to create or repair a knife edge, use a coarse stone. If you want to maintain your knife edge, use a medium stone. If you want to further refine or polish your knife edge, use a fine stone. Now, the reason sharpening stones can actually sharpen your knives is the abrasive particles in the stones are harder than your knife steel. And when you take your knife to a whetstone, metal is literally being scratched off your knife edge. And this is where you'll hear sharpeners talk about scratch patterns. Coarse stones will leave bigger scratches and more spaced apart scratches. Fine stones will leave smaller scratches and they'll be in a more tight pattern on your knife edge. And polishing stones will make your knife edge look more like a mirror. These stones will also dictate what kind of edge finish you get and how it cuts. How a knife cuts is usually referred to as a toothy or a polished edge. A toothy edge is going to be a very bitey, aggressive edge that really bites into food when you cut into it. A polished edge is going to be more of a smooth or a slicey cut, where basically it's going to have less resistance as you're cutting through something. The more you sharpen, the more preference you'll have of whether you want a toothy or a polished edge. You might ask, well, what sharpening stones do I get? And though this has a lot to do with preference, what you're really intending to do, and maybe your budget, I'll definitely give you some of my recommendations. When it comes to the size of stone I would recommend, especially as a beginner sharpener, I would say an 8x3. An 8x3 is going to give you a large enough surface for bigger knives like some kitchen knives. The absolute lowest I would go is 6x2. Some brands of sharpening stones that I would recommend would be like Sharpen, Nanawa, King, Veneve, DMT. These are all great sharpening stones, and you won't be dissatisfied if you get any of these brands. If you're looking for more of a budget stone, the Sharp Pebble is a great budget stone. When it comes to the kind of sharpening stone I would recommend Splash and Go. Basically, you use them as they sound. You basically splash water on them and they're ready to sharpen your knives, rather than getting something like a soaking stone where you have to soak it in water for 10 to 15 minutes before you can use it. But another stone I would recommend is if you could get a combination stone. And a combination stone will have one grit level on one side of the sharpening stone, and when you flip it over, it'll have a different grit level. These can be extremely useful if you want something like a coarse and a medium and a fine, etc. If I had to recommend just one stone, I would definitely recommend getting something in the medium grit range. The reason is that is the grit range that helps you to maintain a sharp knife. As long as you don't let your knives get super dull, a medium stone will always be good to maintain your knife edge.
Lastly, if you're a beginner, I would highly recommend getting diamond stones because there are a lot of steels these days that are called super steels, and diamond stones cut these the best.
Well, I really hope this video has helped you, and if it has, please press that like button for me. And if you know anyone that's trying to learn how to sharpen their knives, please share this with them. And if you haven't already subscribed, I'd be honored to have your subscription.